Hello everyone, welcome to Hayes Secret Tales. Please enjoy this video.
Dawn bleeds pale across the Chicago skyline as Callum Hayes sits on the edge of a hotel bed, phone pressed to his ear, his wedding suit hanging untouched on the bathroom door. His voice is steady, too steady, the way a man sounds when he has decided something irreversible and is simply executing the decision. 3 floors above him, a woman is waking up believing today is the first day of her marriage. She is wrong. Reed Navarro sits at the window with his back turned, watching the city wake up, counting the light changing across the glass, not listening to the words, only to the sound of 8 years of silence finally breaking. 11 minutes. That is all it takes to change everything. But how did they get here? If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you're watching from and subscribe. 8 years earlier, Reed Navarro had walked into the wrong dorm room. That was the most accurate explanation for everything that followed, for every choice that eventually led him to standing in a luxury hotel suite in downtown Chicago, watching Callum Hayes slowly lose his composure the night before the most significant morning of his adult life. If Reed had simply read the room assignment correctly on move-in day freshman year, he would have found his actual roommate, and he never would have met the tall, quietly magnetic pre-law student standing in the doorway of the wrong room looking at Reed with those gray-green eyes that were somehow both guarded and completely open at the same time. But Reed had read the number wrong. He had rolled his overpacked suitcase directly into Callum's space, knocked over a lamp, apologized for approximately 4 minutes while Callum leaned against the doorframe with something that was almost but not quite a smile, and then stood there in the wreckage of his mistake, trying to figure out how to leave. Callum had eventually handed him the lamp and said simply, "You're the 3rd person who's tried to move into my room today. At this point, I'm starting to think the universe is telling me something." He'd smiled then, fully, and Reed had felt something shift underneath his ribcage in a way he wouldn't be able to name for another 18 months. They became friends the way inevitabilities happen, gradually and then completely, with no clear moment of decision that either of them could point to afterward. Reed was studying communications and had a social ease that came naturally to him. Callum was pre-law and had a gravity about him, a serious and thoughtful quality that made people want to earn his attention. When Callum gave you his full focus, it felt like sunlight hitting you directly, warm, and a little too bright to look it straight on. Reed had recognized what he felt somewhere in the middle of sophomore year, not with drama, not with a sudden revelation. Just a quiet afternoon understanding while he sat across a library table watching Callum frown at a contracts textbook and thought, entirely without his own permission, that he wanted to reach across and smooth that furrow between his eyebrows. That was when he knew, and knowing, he had done the only thing that made sense given everything he understood about Callum at the time. He had tucked it carefully away and continued being the best friend Callum had ever had, because that was real and available and something he could actually hold on to. Callum had never come out, not to Reed, not to anyone. He dated women through college, quietly and without much apparent enthusiasm, and Reed had made his observations and kept them in the same place he kept everything else. There was nothing performative about Callum's relationships. He was kind to every woman he dated. He just never seemed to be particularly changed by any of them. He never talked about them with the unguarded animation he brought to talking about a case he was studying, or a documentary he'd fallen into, or the particular way Reed made him laugh, even when he was trying to be serious. They graduated. They both landed in Chicago. Reed built a career in strategic communications for a mid-sized PR firm, and Callum joined a downtown law firm, where he built a reputation faster than anyone expected. They maintained their friendship across the geography of adulthood with the discipline of people who understood that some things were worth the effort. Dinners, weekend plans, phone calls that started as quick check-ins and ended 2 hours later with neither of them entirely sure how that had happened. And then, 3 years ago, Callum had met Daniela Torres at a work event, and 14 months later, he had come to Reed's apartment on a Sunday morning with coffee and news, and what Reed recognized now as a look in his eyes that was not entirely happiness. He had told Reed he was going to propose. Reed had said all the right things and meant them, genuinely, because he had practiced wanting Callum's happiness more than he wanted specific versions of it. He had attended the engagement party. He had accepted the role of best man without hesitation. He had been exactly that for 2 years. The best man, in every possible interpretation of the title. He had organized the bachelor party, which had involved 3 nights in Las Vegas that Callum had spent cheerfully sober, while Reed and the rest of their friends achieved various states of memorable disaster around him. He had coordinated with the wedding planner. He had given Callum's suit measurements to the tailor when Callum had forgotten them. He had shown up for every stressful pre-wedding event with precisely the energy Callum needed him to have, which sometimes meant easy and light, and sometimes meant steady and quiet, because he knew which one was required before Callum had finished a sentence. Tonight had been the actual bachelor party in Chicago, low-key by design, because Callum had specifically requested that. A rooftop bar, 12 of their closest friends, good drinks and easy conversation. The kind of evening that wrapped up at a reasonable hour because Callum had told everyone he wanted to be clear-headed tomorrow. By 11:30, they had all said their goodbyes in the hotel lobby. Callum's older brother had clapped him on the shoulder and told him to get some sleep. The groomsmen had dispersed toward their respective rooms. Because Reed was the best man, and the best man's final duty on the eve of the wedding was to make sure the groom got back to his room in one piece. He had ridden the elevator up with Callum and walked him down the hall. That was all it was supposed to be. Callum had stopped at his suite door and turned to say goodnight. Reed had his room key in his hand. And then Callum had stood there for a moment that stretched too long, his hand resting on the door handle but not turning it, looking at Reed with an expression that Reed had never seen on his face in 8 years, and immediately recognized with a cold, precise certainty. The way you recognize the shape of something dangerous before you can name what it is. "Come in for a second," Callum had said. "Just for a second." Reed had come in, and the door had barely clicked shut before Callum's hands found his own collar. The suite was large, a corner room with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the city's midnight grid, all those amber and white lights stretching toward the lake. Someone, probably the event coordinator, had left a bottle of champagne chilling in an ice bucket near the window, with a small card that said, "Tomorrow is the first day." It stood on the credenza untouched. Neither of them looked at it. Callum had managed 2 buttons before his fingers stopped cooperating. He stood in the center of the room with his shirt half open and his jaw tight, and his eyes doing that thing they did sometimes, that guarded open thing, when he was trying to hold on to composure that was already slipping. He was 31 years old, and one of the sharpest, most controlled people Reed had ever known. And right now he looked exactly like a man, standing at the edge of something very high, with no way back. "Say something," Callum said. His voice was low and a little rough at the edges. I'm waiting to understand what's happening, Reed said. His own voice came out steadier than he felt. He leaned against the closed door and watched Callum carefully. Talk to me. Callum exhaled, a long and uneven breath through his nose. He looked at the window, at the city, at anywhere except Reed, and that told Reed almost everything he needed to know before a single word was spoken. He had watched this man navigate 8 years of carefully maintained composure, and he knew all the tells. The way Callum's jaw worked when he was choosing words, the slight tension in his left hand, fingers curling and straightening against the side of his thigh. The specific quality of silence that meant he was not collecting his thoughts, but rather summoning the courage to say the thoughts he had already collected. I've been doing this calculation, Callum said finally, still facing the window. In my head, all week. Every day of this week, actually, but especially tonight. Watching you across the table, watching you laugh at something Patrick said, and I kept thinking, I kept telling myself there's a number somewhere, some definitive answer I can land on if I just run it long enough. Reed said nothing. He waited. The calculation is, Callum said, and his voice dropped. How many years can a person do this thing where they tell themselves a feeling is manageable, is irrelevant, is not worth acting on, is not the kind of thing you blow up a life for, before the feeling stops being manageable and just becomes the life? He turned from the window then and looked at Reed directly for the first time since they'd walked through the door, and Reed felt the hit of that gaze the same way he always had, like direct sunlight, a little too bright to hold for long. I couldn't find the number. Reed breathed carefully. Callum. I know, Callum said. I know what I'm doing right now. I know what tonight is. I know that she is 3 floors up and that in 11 hours I have to be standing at the front of a church in a suit that cost more than my first car. I know all of it. He moved toward Reed then, not quickly, not with urgency, just with that quiet and inevitable quality that had always characterized him, purposefully, like a man who knows where he is going, even when he is terrified of the destination. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that Reed could smell the cedar and citrus of his cologne and the warm human undertone beneath it, close enough to be overwhelming in the way Callum had always been overwhelming when the distance between them got this small. I know that this is the worst possible moment in the history of worst possible moments. I know that. And I'm still standing here, which I think tells you everything about how the calculation turned out. Reed's hands were flat against the door behind him. He kept them there deliberately. What are you asking me? I don't know exactly. Callum's voice cracked slightly on the last word, a fracture in that smooth surface that Reed had almost never heard before. That's the honest answer. I don't have vocabulary for this. I've spent 15 years not developing vocabulary for this, because developing vocabulary means acknowledging it exists. A pause. I know what I feel. Right now, standing here, in this room with you on the night before, I walked down an aisle toward a life I chose because I convinced myself this wasn't an option. I know exactly what I feel. His eyes stayed level on Reed's face, and there was something raw and exhausted in them now. Something that looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and had finally reached a point where he could not take another step with it. I've loved you, he said, for longer than I've been willing to say that word, longer than I've been willing to admit it applied to what I felt. And I have never once touched you, not the way I've thought about. And tomorrow I'm going to swear in front of everyone we know that I will spend the rest of my life with someone else. Reed closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. He counted them. 1, 2, 3. Then he opened them. Callum was still there, still watching him with that gutted, open, terrifying expression. "You should have said this," Reed said, his voice quiet and measured even though his chest felt like it was doing something structurally inadvisable. "You should have said any version of this at any point in the last 8 years. I know, because I have felt this way about you since we were 20 years old, Callum." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Reed had ever stood inside. He watched the information move across Callum's face in real time, watched the way his jaw went slack and then tightened, watched the precise moment when understanding arrived and settled, when the thing Callum had apparently hoped for but not dared to count on became confirmed fact. It was a significant face to watch receive significant news. Even at 31, even exhausted and emotionally wrecked on the eve of his wedding, Callum Hayes was arresting in a way that had nothing to do with conventional handsomeness, though he had that too. 6'2", lean but broad through the shoulders, dark hair kept short on the sides and longer on top, currently slightly disheveled from the night out. Those gray-green eyes under dark lashes, a jaw that was a little too sharp to be soft and a little too expressive to be truly hard. He looked like someone's idea of a person who was made to be both the most important thing in a room and entirely unaware of it. Reed had spent 8 years being aware of it for him. "Reed," Callum said, and his voice had gone very quiet. "I'm not telling you that so you feel better," Reed said, "or so you feel worse. I'm telling you because if we're being honest tonight, we're being honest about everything. You don't get to stand there and say it's been one-sided." Callum exhaled again, and this time it came out shaky in a way that made Reed's heart constrict. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture uncharacteristically unguarded. "I don't know what to do. I don't know what I'm asking you for. I just know that I cannot walk into tomorrow having never understood what this is, what it actually feels like, whether it's what I think it is, or whether I've built it into something it isn't in my own head." Reed looked at him for a long moment. The city glittered behind him through the window. "Sit down," Reed said. Callum looked at him. "Sit down. We're going to talk first. Actually talk, before anything else happens or doesn't happen. Because you're about to make some kind of decision about your entire life, and you're going to make it with a clear head." Something in Callum's expression shifted. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated. He moved to the sofa near the window, a low cream-colored thing that probably cost more than Reed's monthly rent, and sat, not with the polished posture he usually carried in professional settings, but with the slightly collapsed, genuinely exhausted posture of a man at the end of a very long road. He leaned his elbows on his knees and let his hands hang between them, and looked at the floor for a moment before looking back up at Reed. Reed pulled the armchair from the corner, turned it to face Callum, and sat, 4 feet between them, a safe enough distance to think clearly. He hoped. "Tell me about Daniela," Reed said. Callum blinked. "What? Tell me about her, not the facts. I know the facts. Tell me how you feel when you're with her." A long pause. Callum looked at the window. "She's extraordinary," he said, and there was real warmth in his voice, real genuine feeling, which was both reassuring and devastating. "She's brilliant and driven, and she makes me laugh, and she is absolutely certain about who she is, in a way I have always admired. She deserves someone who is equally certain. But," another pause, longer, "but when I'm with her, I feel like I'm doing something correctly, like I'm executing a plan that everyone around me endorses, and that I designed, and that on paper is exactly what a good life looks like." He looked back at Reed. "And when I'm with you, I feel like I'm awake." Reed absorbed that, let it sit in the air between them rather than rushing to fill the space. "That's been true for a long time," Callum continued. I used to tell myself it was because you're my best friend, that of course I feel more myself with you. That's what a best friend is. And then I'd be lying in bed next to Daniela and thinking about a conversation we'd had 3 days earlier, and I'd think, this isn't what a best friend is. This is something else. And I'd talk myself down from that edge and go to sleep and keep going. How long have you known? Not suspected. Known. Callum was quiet for almost a full minute. Since the night of Patrick's wedding, 4 years ago. Reed remembered it. Of course he remembered it. Patrick's wedding in Napa, the outdoor ceremony at dusk, the reception in a stone barn with Edison lights strung across the rafters, all of them a little sunburned and very well fed and progressively, gently, happily drunk on good California wine. Reed remembered dancing, which he did without self-consciousness, because he'd learned in college that caring about looking foolish on a dance floor was an enormous waste of everyone's time. He remembered Callum watching him from the side of the room with a drink in his hand and an expression that Reed had registered and immediately filed in the place where he kept everything he couldn't afford to look at directly. You were dancing, Callum said. You were dancing with Priya, and you were completely ridiculous, and you made her laugh so hard she grabbed your arm for balance, and you caught her, and you kept dancing. And I was standing 20 feet away thinking, I wanted to be the one you were pulling back onto the dance floor. And then I thought, no, that's not right either. I wanted you to look at me the way you were looking at her, like I was the most worth dancing with. And then I thought, actually, I wanted to be the reason you dance like that. I wanted that to be mine. He exhaled slowly. And then I thought, well, that's inconvenient. Reed laughed. It came out involuntarily, a short, startled sound, and then he covered his mouth with his hand, and Callum looked at him, and after a moment he laughed too, the most genuinely unguarded sound Reed had heard from him all week. It lasted about 5 seconds and then subsided, and they sat there looking at each other in the quiet aftermath. And the air in the room felt slightly different, slightly less like the inside of a pressurized chamber. 4 years, Reed said. 4 years, Callum confirmed, of knowing and not doing anything about it, because by then we were together and she's wonderful, and I thought, maybe this is something I can carry. Maybe it gets smaller over time. He looked at Reed steadily. It got bigger. Reed put his elbows on his knees, mirroring Callum's posture without intending to. Then you shouldn't get married tomorrow. Callum looked at him with an expression that was patient and bone-achingly tired. I know that. Do you? Yes, Reed, I know that. His voice was quiet, not defensive, just honest and exhausted. I have known it for approximately 48 hours in some complete, inescapable way I cannot rationalize past. I knew it when I was sitting at rehearsal dinner yesterday, watching you give the toast and thinking, he's the only person in this room who actually knows what I'm afraid of. I knew it when I woke up this morning, and my first thought was how many hours until I can just be alone with Reed. He looked at his hands. I have been sitting with this for 2 days, and I have not had one clear thought about anything, except that I am about to do something I cannot undo, and I am not sure I am the person she thinks she's marrying. The suite was very quiet. The city hummed beyond the glass. I need to call her, Callum said. I know what has to happen. I've known it for 48 hours, and I have been terrified of it, and I'm going to have to do it. He looked up at Reed with an expression that was complicated and desperate and very young in a way Callum rarely was. I just need, before I make that call, before this night becomes the night I blow everything up, I need to sit here for a little while longer. Not do it yet. Can I have that? Can I just have this room, and you, and another hour of it being almost, and not yet, and I haven't had to do the hard thing yet? Reed leaned back in the armchair and looked at him. 8 years of everything. And Callum Hayes sitting 4 feet away on a cream sofa in a suit with 2 buttons undone, looking like a man who was finally done pretending. Yeah, Reed said, you can have that. And so they sat together in the humming quiet of midnight, and slowly, the way water finds its level, the conversation found its way down from the high altitude of confession into something gentler and more sustaining. They talked the way they always talked when the world had stopped pressing in on them, easily and without agenda, one sentence building on another, the way 2 people who share 8 years of fluent friendship talk. Reed told him about the PR campaign he'd been managing, the one that had consumed his last 6 weeks. Callum leaned back into the sofa and listened with that focused attention that was specific to things he genuinely cared about, which apparently included Reed's professional life, even on the night of every other crisis. Then, Callum talked about the case he'd been working before the wedding week. Chaos consumed his schedule, his voice taking on that particular low-frequency energy of someone who has forgotten to perform his emotions because the genuine ones have taken over. Reed watched him and remembered exactly why he had spent 8 years being what he was for this man. Because it was real, and it was specific, and it was Callum, and nothing about that had ever been something Reed could simplify away. At some point, Callum had taken off his jacket and draped it over the arm of the sofa. At some point, Reed had moved from the armchair to the sofa itself, not consciously deciding to, just finding himself closer, the way he always found himself closer when they'd been talking long enough for the geography to stop feeling loaded. They were not touching. There were 18 inches of sofa cushion between them. The city still glittered through the window, and the champagne sat in its ice bucket, which was probably warm water by now. But the temperature of the air between them was entirely different from what it had been an hour ago. Not cooler, the opposite, as if the long, circling conversation had been the closing of a distance rather than the keeping of one. "There's something I've wondered," Callum said. They drifted into silence a moment before, the comfortable kind. His eyes were on the window. "Tell me," Reed said, "whether it's just you." A pause. "Whether it's specifically you, which is what it feels like, or whether it's something broader, something I've been avoiding looking at, and you're just the particular form it's taken because you're the person I've been closest to." He turned his head, looking at Reed with something genuinely curious in his eyes. "Do you think that matters? Which one it is?" Reed considered it honestly. "I think you're asking whether what you feel is about your orientation or about me specifically." "Yes. I don't think those are separate questions. I think the answer to one is part of the answer to the other. I think you've spent 15 years not looking at something about yourself, and I think the specific shape it took, the specific person who became the focus of it, that's not an accident. People don't accidentally spend 8 years feeling exactly this way about a person who happens to be their best friend." Callum absorbed this. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were still. 15 years. That's most of my adult life. Yes. That's a lot of time to spend not looking at something. It is. Another silence. Then very quietly, "I'm angry at myself. For the time. For Daniela, who doesn't deserve to wake up tomorrow to a phone call that dismantles everything she's planned. For you, He stopped. "Don't," Reed said. "Don't do that part yet. The self-recrimination. That's for later, after. Right now, you're just a person who finally stopped running and landed somewhere, and is figuring out what the ground feels like." Callum looked at him. Those gray-green eyes in the warm, dim hotel light. You're very good at this. I've known you a long time. No, I mean... Callum shifted on the sofa, turned toward Reed more fully. The 18 inches between them had become 12, slowly and without formal announcement. You're good at being what I need, whatever version of that. You've been doing it for 8 years and I've taken it completely for granted, and I need to say that out loud. I know that. I'm sorry for that. Reed shook his head. You don't need to... I do. Callum's voice had the quiet firmness that came into it when he'd decided something. I stayed in that dynamic because it was safe, because I told myself that being close to you in a way I could sustain was better than reaching for something I wasn't brave enough to want openly. And that was me using you to manage my own avoidance, even if I didn't have the language for that at the time. Reed looked at him for a long moment. The careful way Callum held his body, the tension of someone who had said everything he needed to say and was now very still in the aftermath of it. Callum, Reed said, yeah, I have never once in 8 years felt used. I've felt frustrated and sometimes sad and occasionally quite spectacularly terrible about the whole situation, but I have never felt like you were taking something from me. I stayed because I chose to, because you're the best friend I've ever had, and because I would rather have the version of you I could have than spend my life without any version at all. We were both doing the same thing. Callum's expression moved through something complicated and landed somewhere gentler. We were idiots, he said. Spectacular idiots, Reed agreed. 8 years. 8 years. Something shifted in the air, not dramatically, not with any sudden change in the light or the temperature or the sound of the city beyond the glass. Just a slow, quiet, gravitational thing. Callum was looking at Reed with an expression that was no longer performing anything at all. No composure, no management, no careful calculation of what he was allowed to feel. Just Callum. Just exactly what was actually there. And Reed had been close enough to it all these years to recognize it, even though he had never been allowed to look at it directly before. I need to ask you something, Callum said. His voice was very quiet now. Reed said nothing, waited. And I need you to be honest with me, not careful, not considerate of consequences, just honest. Okay. Callum's left hand, resting on the sofa cushion between them, moved, not reaching, just turning slightly, palm up, an unconscious gesture, or something trying to look unconscious. Reed felt it the way you feel the change in barometric pressure before weather arrives. Is there a version of tonight? Callum said slowly, his eyes completely steady on Reed's. Where I don't call her until morning, where I wait until morning to do the right thing and spend the rest of this night here with you, understanding what I've never let myself understand. A pause. His jaw worked. I'm not asking you to fix anything. I'm not asking for promises or a plan. I just want to know if it's possible to have this one night, the real version of it, before everything else happens. Reed looked at him. The upturned palm, the gray-green eyes, the city holding its breath behind the glass. He thought about everything that came before this moment. He thought about all the ways he had been good and careful and measured for 8 years. And he thought about Callum Hayes at 20 years old, in the wrong dorm room, looking at him with those eyes that were both guarded and completely open. Callum, Reed said quietly. Yeah. You know that I'm going to say yes. Callum exhaled. It was a long, unsteady sound, and in it Reed could hear 8 years and 48 hours of held breath releasing simultaneously. Callum's hand turned further, reaching now, and Reed's met it, and that was all. Just their hands on the sofa cushion between them. and yet it felt like a conversation that had been conducting itself underground for the better part of a decade finally breaking the surface. They sat like that for a moment, neither of them moving toward anything yet, the city humming beyond the glass, the uncorked pressure of everything settling into the room like something that lived there now. Then Callum said very softly, "I don't know how to do this." "I know," Reed said. "I mean specifically. I've never—" He stopped. His hand tightened slightly around Reed's. "With anyone. Not in this direction. I don't know what I'm—" "I know," Reed said again. "And that's okay. There's no performance here. You don't have to know anything." Callum looked at their hands, then up at Reed's face, and then he leaned forward, just slightly, just enough to close the last of the distance between them, and Reed met him. And when their mouths found each other for the first time, the world didn't stop or start or do anything dramatic. It was just very quiet and very still and absolutely real in the way that things are real when you've been circling them long enough that the reality is not a shock but an arrival. Callum kissed him carefully at first, the way he did everything when he was learning it, with full and focused attention. And then something in him gave way, some last-held thing releasing, and the careful became something else, something warmer and more desperate and deeply, entirely human. Reed felt his hands find Callum's jaw, felt the particular warmth of his face, the slight stubble at this hour of the night, and the low sound Callum made was the sound of someone who has been thirsty for a long time finally finding water. Reed pulled him closer and let the 8 years collapse between them like a folded thing finally opened. They broke apart after a long moment. Callum's forehead dropped against Reed's, and they both stayed there, breathing, neither of them speaking. Callum's hands were gripping the front of Reed's shirt in a way that was not particularly composed and very completely honest. "Oh," Callum said very quietly. "Yeah," Reed said. "Oh, yeah." A long silence. The city breathed. Callum's grip on Reed's shirt didn't loosen. "That answers the question," Callum said, his voice low and a little unsteady. "The one I was asking, about whether it was specific to you or something broader." "What's the answer?" Reed asked. Though he already knew, Callum lifted his head just enough to look at Reed directly, those gray-green eyes from 12 inches away, a distance Reed had never held them at before and which was, he thought, absolutely nothing like enough. "Both," Callum said. "It's both. And it's specifically and completely you." Reed looked at him. His hands were still cupping Callum's jaw. Callum's hands were still in his shirt. They were very close, and the room was warm, and the night was still very young. "Tell me something," Reed said. "Anything," Callum said. And the word came out with a conviction that was entirely new, the conviction of a man who had stopped performing an answer and started actually giving one. "Tell me what you want. Not what you think is appropriate to want. Not what makes sense given the circumstances. Just what you actually, honestly want right now." Callum looked at him for a long moment. His chest rose and fell with a breath that was slow and deliberate. "I want to understand you," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Every part of this. Everything I've never let myself have. I want to stop being someone who doesn't reach for things because he's afraid of what reaching means about him." His hand loosened from Reed's shirt and moved upward, settling against the side of Reed's neck, warm and careful and entirely new. "I want you to show me. I want tonight to be real. I want to know what real feels like for once." Reed's pulse was doing something unmistakable in the quiet of the room. "Okay," he said. "We'll take it slow." "I don't want slow," Callum said, and his voice had changed. It was still quiet, but the texture of it was different, lower, more direct, the voice he used when he'd stopped negotiating and arrived at the thing he actually meant. I've been slow for 8 years. I want to feel everything. I want you to show me everything I've kept myself from. And I want you to do it tonight, in this room, before I have to become the person who does the hard and right thing in the morning. I am asking you, Reed. I am actually asking you. Show me. Reed looked at him for a moment that felt like it held the weight of 8 years in it. And then he reached out and touched the side of Callum's face, his thumb tracing the line of his jaw, gentle and deliberate, and watched Callum's eyes close involuntarily at the touch. Watched the long exhale leave his body like something finally permitted. The city glittered its endless grid beyond the glass. The champagne sat in its warm water. The small card said, "Tomorrow is the first day." And Reed thought, not for the last time that night, that whoever had written that had no idea how precisely true it was. "Okay," Reed said quietly. He leaned forward and kissed Callum again, slower this time, with all the patience he had. "Then let me show you." And outside, somewhere 3 floors above them, Tomorrow was still sleeping. But in here, in this corner room full of city light and 8 years of everything finally arriving, the night had only just begun. The kiss started slow, the way Reed had learned in 8 years of knowing Callum, that everything important had to start with him. Not because Callum was fragile. He was anything but. It was because Callum processed the world with his whole body, took things in through all of his senses at once before allowing himself to respond, and rushing him was like rushing the tide. It went where it was going regardless. You either moved with it or you got knocked sideways. So Reed kissed him slowly, deliberately, the way he had imagined kissing him approximately 10,000 times since sophomore year of college, though the imagination had been theoretical, and this was not. This was Callum's hands in his shirt again, gripping the fabric with that white-knuckled honesty that Reed had already decided was one of the most beautiful things he had ever felt. This was Callum's breath coming slightly faster than normal against his mouth, that careful control beginning to fracture at its seams. This was the low sound Callum made when Reed deepened the kiss, not loud, barely a sound at all, but entirely uninhibited and entirely real. And Reed had been collecting Callum's unguarded moments for 8 years, and this was the most unguarded one he had ever witnessed. He pulled back just enough to breathe. Callum's forehead came forward, following, not wanting even an inch of distance. "Still okay?" Reed asked. His voice came out lower than intended. Callum's eyes opened, gray-green and very close and very dark in the low lamp-warm light of the hotel suite. "More than okay," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. "Don't stop." Reed reached up and slowly, deliberately, finished the buttons of Callum's shirt that Callum had started himself when they'd first come through the door. His fingers worked them one by one, unhurried, watching Callum's face the entire time, watching the particular expression that moved across it as the shirt fell open, something between exposure and relief. Like a man who has been holding his breath underwater, finally breaking the surface and finding the air is exactly what he needed. Reed spread his hands flat against Callum's chest, feeling the warmth of his skin, the steady drum beat beneath his ribs that was slightly faster than its resting rhythm. Callum looked down at those hands and then back up at Reed's face, and his expression was something Reed had no word for, but recognized completely. It was Callum seeing something he had decided was impossible suddenly existing in front of him, and not quite knowing how to carry the weight of its being real. "Your heart is racing," Reed said. "I'm aware," Callum said. "That's okay." "I know it is." He exhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling under Reed's palms. "I just keep thinking, this is real, this is actually happening. And then I think, no, I've thought things like this before while half asleep, and then I realize I can feel your hands, and that's not something I've ever been able to feel in the half-asleep version. He looked at Reed directly. You're warmer than I imagined. Reed felt something move through his chest at that. Not just want, though that was certainly present, loud and specific and years in the making. Something gentler than want. Something that had patience built into it. How long have you been imagining? He asked. Callum's mouth curved slightly, the smallest version of that smile Reed had been cataloging since they were 20. Long enough that this feels like a memory more than a first time. Reed kissed him again, and this time it had something different in it. Something that knew where it was going. His hands moved from Callum's chest to his shoulders, pushing the open shirt back, and Callum let it fall from his arms without any hesitation, which told Reed everything about where Callum's composure had gotten to. This was a man who controlled everything in his life with precise and careful attention, and he had just let his shirt fall to a hotel floor without looking at where it landed. Reed took a moment to appreciate that, filed it away next to all the other things he was collecting tonight. He was quieter than Reed had expected. Reed had imagined in his more self-indulgent moments that Callum might be the same way when undone that he was in arguments, precise and verbal, constructing the experience with language. But this Callum, this post-threshold Callum, communicated almost entirely through his hands and through those small, quiet sounds that escaped him at intervals that Reed was beginning to learn. The sounds happened at specific moments. When Reed's mouth found his jaw, when Reed's hand spread flat and firm across the plane of his back, pulling him close. When Reed leaned in and spoke quietly against his ear, not words exactly, just the low warmth of sound, and Callum turned toward it instinctively, the way something turns toward heat. "Come here," Reed said, and guided him backward toward the edge of the bed. Callum moved with him, then stopped, right at the edge of it. His hands found Reed's forearms, not stopping him, just holding. And Reed went still immediately, reading the pause the way he read all of Callum's pauses. "What is it?" Reed asked. Callum looked at the bed, then at Reed, then at the window, at the city beyond it, at the dark middle distance of a man looking at something internal. "I keep thinking about what I'm walking away from in the morning," he said. His voice was steady, but there was weight in it. "Not her specifically. That decision has been made, I know that. I mean what I'm walking away from in terms of the version of myself I've been performing." He looked at Reed again. The version who had everything sorted, who made the rational choice, who convinced himself that what he felt for you was manageable and adjacent and not the most central thing in his life. A pause. "I've been that person for a long time, and tonight I stop." Reed looked at him carefully. "Are you afraid of that?" "Terrified," Callum said, without hesitation, and also, somehow, completely calm. He looked down at where his hands were wrapped around Reed's forearms. "That's you. That's because you're here. That's the thing I've been missing the whole time. The specific way you make everything feel like it's going to be survivable." Reed's throat did something complicated. He covered Callum's hands with his own, turning them so their fingers interlocked. "It's going to be survivable," he said. "All of it. Tomorrow and everything after it. Because you'll be there? Because you're braver than you've been giving yourself credit for." Reed squeezed his hands. "And yes, because I'll be there." Callum looked at him for a long moment. The city breathed beyond the glass. Then something settled in his face, the final something, the last piece of held tension releasing. And he sat down on the edge of the bed and brought Reed with him and kissed him with a thoroughness that suggested he was done thinking about what came after and was choosing entirely and deliberately to be here instead. Just here, just this, just now. Reed let him, followed him down into it. Let the kiss be what it wanted to be, which was no longer tentative, which was no longer uncertain, which was Callum Hayes finally, at 31 years old, understanding what it felt like to reach for something and actually touch it. They found their way onto the bed, the way you find your way to things in the dark, not by seeing, but by feeling, by the gravity of what already wants to happen. Reed laid Callum back against the pillows and knelt over him and took a moment to simply look at him, which Callum endured for approximately 4 seconds before he made an impatient sound that was new in Reed's collection and reached up to pull Reed down to him. "Don't look at me like that," Callum said, his voice low. "Like what?" "Like I'm something you're about to lose." Reed settled beside him, propped on one arm, his other hand resting on Callum's chest. "You're not something I'm losing," he said. "You're something I'm just now getting to have." Something moved across Callum's face at that. He turned his head and looked at Reed from very close range. "I want to feel that," he said quietly. "I want to feel what that means. All of it. I want you to show me what I've been saying no to." Reed moved his hand slowly from Callum's chest, tracing a deliberate path along his ribs, and Callum's breath changed immediately, going shorter and more conscious, the way breathing becomes conscious when it stops being automatic. His eyes stayed on Reed's face the whole time, watching, which was new and specific and very Callum, this man who needed to look at things directly in order to believe they were real. "You're allowed to close your eyes," Reed said. "I don't want to," Callum said. "I've had my eyes closed for 15 years. I want to see this." Reed kissed him again, softer, at the corner of his mouth, then along his jaw, finding the place just below his ear that made Callum's head tip sideways involuntarily, made that quiet sound come again, and Reed took his time there, learning it, committing the precise geography of it to memory. Callum's hand found the back of Reed's head, not directing, just resting there, an anchor. "Reed," Callum said. Just the name, no question in it, no request, just the word itself as its own thing, as punctuation, as confirmation that this was real, and Reed was real, and the night was real. "I'm here," Reed said against his throat. "I know." His hand tightened slightly in Reed's hair. "I know you are." They moved together slowly at first, both of them learning what the other was, what sounds meant what, where the landscape of the other person became territory they recognized and wanted to know better. Reed was deliberate in everything, not out of caution exactly, but out of the same instinct that made him a good friend, the instinct toward attention, toward paying the kind of respect to Callum that Callum paid to things he cared about, which was total and without distraction. And Callum was extraordinary in the way that things are extraordinary when they are finally permitted to be themselves. He was not passive. He had never been passive at anything in his life, and he was not passive now. He reached, he pulled, he communicated through pressure and through those quiet sounds and through the particular way his hands moved across Reed with a focused curiosity that felt like an extension of how Callum's mind worked. Always tracing things back to their origin, always wanting to understand the mechanism, always finding the exact question that got to the center of the thing. The difference was that he did not know what he was doing yet. He knew the direction of what he wanted, but not all of the ways to get there. And that combination, the wanting and the not yet knowing, was one of the most intimate things Reed had ever been trusted with. Callum Hayes, who knew almost everything he needed to know about almost everything that mattered to him, handing Reed the specific and precious territory of his own inexperience, his own newness. Reed moved over him, gathered him close, felt the exact moment when Callum stopped thinking and started only feeling, the precise transition from consciousness to surrender that Reed had been slowly and patiently working him toward. It happened gradually, the way good things do, one layer at a time, one breath at a time, one small held thing releasing, and then another, until Callum was no longer calculating anything at all and was simply here, in this room, in these sheets, in the warm, dark hotel air with Reed. And for the first time, Reed could feel that Callum was fully present in his own body. Not performing it, not narrating it, not managing his responses. Just in it, just feeling it. "There you are," Reed said softly, without meaning to say it out loud. Callum's eyes opened. "What?" "Nothing." Reed kissed him. "You're okay." "Better than okay," Callum said. He sounded slightly undone, which was a sound Reed was going to spend a significant amount of the rest of his life being grateful for. "Reed, I need you to—" "I know," Reed said. "I've got you." And he did. He had always had him. That was the thing that 8 years of management and distance and careful maintenance had never quite obscured. The fundamental truth that Reed Navarro had always been the person who had Callum Hayes in every sense that mattered, and tonight was simply the first time they were both willing to stand in that truth and call it by its real name. What came next belonged to the two of them entirely, to the specific privacy of that corner hotel room with the city's amber light through the glass and the untouched champagne going warm and the small card that said, "Tomorrow is the first day." What happened between them was not dramatic or performed. It was private and true, and punctuated by Callum's quiet sounds and Reed's patient hands and the specific electricity of two people who have known each other long enough to skip the parts that are only about distance and go straight to the parts that are about depth. At some point, Callum said Reed's name with a quality in it that Reed had never heard before and recognized immediately. The quality of a man arriving somewhere he had spent years not being allowed to go. And Reed pulled him closer and stayed with him through the arriving, through the particular intensity of the destination, until Callum's hands finally stilled and the sounds finally subsided and the room returned to its quiet and his breath came back to him in long, slow, settling waves. Reed held him, said nothing, let the silence be what it needed to be, which was a container for something that didn't have words yet. Callum lay still for a long time, his breath slowing. His hands, which had been gripping Reed with a focused desperation, gradually unclenching and spreading flat, relaxed for the first time since they'd walked through the door. The city continued its amber business beyond the glass. Somewhere far below, a cab horn sounded twice and disappeared. "Okay," Callum said finally. His voice was different, quieter, settled, in the way that water settles after something has moved through it. "Okay? Okay?" Reed asked. "Okay as in?" Callum paused, seemed to search for the right language. "Okay as in, that was not what I expected." Reed raised an eyebrow. "Bad not expected or good not expected?" Callum turned his head to look at him, those gray-green eyes in the lamplight, completely clear, completely unguarded, completely present. "The second one," he said. "Significantly the second one." A pause. "I think I've been making a decision based on incorrect information for 15 years. Reed laughed quietly. "What information?" "The information that this was going to be tolerable to deny." Callum looked back at the ceiling. "I assumed, on some level, That whatever I was refusing was going to be proportional to what I had imagined. That it would be good, but manageable. That understanding it was not going to make refusing it feel like a genuine amputation. He turned his head back to Reed. I was wrong about that. Reed watched him. How do you feel right now? Callum considered the question the way he always considered things he actually wanted to answer correctly. Terrified, he said, lighter than I've felt in years. Like something that was wrong with me for a very long time has just been corrected, which is both enormous relief and quite a lot of grief because of the time. And also like I want to do that again, which under the circumstances is probably somewhat inconvenient. Only somewhat? Reed said. The corner of Callum's mouth curved, that small version of the smile, maybe significantly. He reached over, found Reed's hand in the dark between them, and held it. Not urgently this time, just held it, loose and easy and certain. I need to call her in the morning. I know. And I need to figure out where I go after that. Not tonight, but I need to figure out a lot of things. I know, Reed said again. Are you going to be there for that? For the figuring out? Reed looked at him. The city, the lamplight, the man he had been loving without permission for the better part of a decade, lying beside him in a hotel bed, holding his hand, with the careful certainty of someone who finally knows what they're holding on to and why. I'm not going anywhere, Reed said. I've been not going anywhere for 8 years. I'm very good at it. Callum's smile widened slightly. Then it softened into something that was not a smile at all, but was something better. I love you, he said. Not dramatically, not with the weight of confession this time, but with the ease of something finally at home in its own sentence. I've loved you for longer than I've been able to say that, and I'm saying it now because I want you to have heard it from me. When I was completely clear-headed and completely certain and completely undramatic about it. Reed felt the words settle into him, the way warmth settles into cold hands. Slow and total and a little overwhelming. I love you too, he said. I've loved you since you handed me a lamp and told me the universe was trying to tell you something. Callum blinked. I forgot about the lamp. I haven't. A silence. Then Callum pressed his forehead against Reed's shoulder, and Reed felt the weight of it, the specific warmth of it, and something in him that had been held carefully at a distance for 8 years simply stopped holding and let go. They lay like that for a long time, the city doing its midnight things beyond the glass, the champagne fully warm now in its bucket of water, the card with its small, forward-facing sentence waiting on the credenza. Tell me something, Callum said eventually, his voice muffled slightly against Reed's shoulder. What? Tell me something you've wanted to say to me for 8 years that you never said. Reed thought about it. There were many candidates. He chose the one that felt most true tonight. Every time you gave the toast at someone else's wedding, he said, I sat in the audience and thought that whoever was standing up there getting married was the luckiest person in the room, not because of their partner, because of the speech you were giving them, because of the way you talked about what love looked like when it was working, and I thought, you know exactly what it should look like. You're describing it with perfect precision, and I wanted to stand up every single time and say, you're describing us, you idiot. Callum was very still for a moment. Then his shoulders moved. Reed recognized the movement. He was laughing, silently, the way Callum laughed when something hit the exact right note, the laugh that started in his chest and worked its way out without making much noise. I was, Callum said finally. I was describing us, every single time. I know, Reed said. We really were spectacular idiots. Historically unprecedented idiots. Noted. Callum lifted his head from Reed's shoulder and looked at him. The gray-green eyes still clear, still present, but softer now, edged with a tiredness. That was the good kind. The kind that comes after something significant has been set down. What happens now? Tonight, nothing, Reed said. Tonight you sleep. You need to sleep. Tomorrow you make the phone call and then you deal with what comes after it. And I will be in whatever room is directly adjacent to all of that available for the exact version of support you need, whether that's someone to talk to or someone to be quiet with or someone to put coffee in your hand and not ask you questions. Callum looked at him steadily. And after all of that, after tomorrow and the week after that, and the part where I have to tell people, and where things get complicated and loud. After all of that, Reed said, we figure out what this is when it has room to breathe. When it's not happening in a hotel suite at midnight the night before everything changes. When it's just the two of us in a Tuesday and no particular occasion. Callum absorbed this. That sounds terrifying. That's what ordinary looks like when you've never let yourself have it. Is ordinary something you want? With me? Knowing what ordinary with me actually involves, which is a significant amount of late nights and case files and the specific kind of stress that makes me completely unbearable to be around for 3 days at a time. Callum, Reed said, yeah. I've been your best friend for 8 years. I've been around for every 3-day stretch of complete unbearability you've had in all of that time. I am not newly informed about what ordinary with you involves. Callum was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, okay. Okay, Reed said. And that was that. Not a grand statement. Not a resolution that tied everything neatly. Just two people on the other side of something enormous agreeing, in the way adults agree, on what came next, knowing it was not going to be simple and choosing it anyway. Callum reached over and turned off the bedside lamp. The room went from warm gold to the cooler ambient silver of the city's reflection off the low clouds. The skyline continued its perpetual business beyond the glass. Indifferent and beautiful, those million-lit windows that belonged to a million other people, doing a million other things that had nothing to do with the two of them. Reed lay in the dark and felt Callum settle beside him, felt the specific weight and warmth of him in the bed, and thought that this was the most improbable version of a Tuesday night he had ever experienced, and that he would not have changed a single element of it. Callum was quiet for several minutes. Reed thought he might be falling asleep. Reed. Yeah, for what it's worth. A pause. Whatever comes tomorrow, whatever the next weeks look like, I am not sorry this happened. Good, Reed said. I want to be clear that I understand the damage I'm doing. To Daniela, to the plans, to the people who've made arrangements and bought plane tickets and are sleeping right now in this hotel without knowing any of this is happening. I understand the weight of that, and I'm going to carry it. But I am still not sorry that tonight happened. You shouldn't be, Reed said. Doing the right thing isn't retroactively made wrong by the timing. That's a very communications major way to say that. I've had 8 years to workshop it. Another silence. Then Callum exhaled, long and slow and final, the way breathing sounds when a person is genuinely letting go of something. I'm going to sleep, he said. Good. Will you still be here when I wake up? Reed looked at the ceiling, at the silver city light moving slowly across it. I'm not going anywhere, he said. I already told you, I'm very good at not going anywhere. He heard rather than saw Callum smile in the dark, and then Callum was quiet, and his breathing changed in that way that means the drop into sleep has happened, quick and complete, the way it happens for people who are genuinely exhausted. And Reed lay beside him in the silver dark and listened to the city and thought about everything. He thought about the lamp in the wrong dorm room. He thought about the library table and the contracts textbook and the furrow between Callum's eyebrows. He thought about Sunday mornings with coffee and news and not entirely happy eyes, and Patrick's wedding in Napa and 20 feet of distance, and an expression being filed in a place where he kept things he couldn't afford to look at directly. He thought about 2 years of best man, about suit measurements and bachelor parties and toasts at other people's weddings where Callum had described something perfectly and neither of them had named it. He thought about how long it was possible to love something carefully from a distance and whether the careful distance was courage or cowardice, and decided it was probably both, which was true of most things people did in order to survive. And he thought about tonight, about Callum's upturned palm on the sofa cushion, about the specific way Callum had said, "I want to feel everything," with that voice that had no performance left in it at all, about the slow collapse of 8 years of management into something that was finally, just honestly, true. He was still thinking when sleep found him too, not suddenly. Gradually, the way good things happen, the thoughts becoming slower and less consecutive, and more like the sensation of warmth, like lying in a patch of sun, like the particular quality of rest that comes after something has been resolved that was very long in the resolving. When Reed woke, the light in the room was different. The city's silver had given way to the first gray of pre-dawn, that uncertain hour before the sky decides what color it intends to be. The clock on the bedside table read 5:47 in the morning. Callum was awake. Reed could tell by the quality of his stillness, which was the stillness of someone who was lying very quiet because they were thinking very hard, not the stillness of sleep. He was on his back, staring at the ceiling, and his jaw was set the way it's set when he was doing the thing where he built the argument and then rebuilt it and then found the flaw and rebuilt it again. "How long have you been awake?" Reed asked. "About 40 minutes, Callum said. He didn't turn his head. "I was going to let you sleep longer." "What are you thinking about?" "Everything." A pause. "Specifically, how to make the phone call, what to say, whether there is a version of what needs to be said that is both honest and not catastrophically cruel, and whether those two things are compatible in this particular situation." Reed turned onto his side, looking at Callum's profile against the early light. "They're compatible," he said. "Honesty and kindness are compatible. Not comfortable, but compatible." "She's going to ask why." Callum's voice was level, controlled, back to its professional register. The morning voice. The voice of a man preparing to do something difficult and deciding to do it exactly right. "And the truth is, going to hurt her. But a lie would hurt her more, and for longer." "Yes. I should call her now, before she wakes up expecting this to be her wedding day." He finally turned his head to look at Reed. In the gray pre-dawn light, his eyes were serious and clear and fully committed. "I need to do it now, while it's still early enough to change what this day becomes." Reed held his gaze. "Okay. I need you to be in the room when I do it. Not listening, not involved, just in the room. Is that—" "Yes," Reed said, before he finished the question. "I'll be here." Callum nodded once, sat up, ran a hand through his hair, the gesture that Reed had catalogued as the one he used when he was setting aside what he felt in order to do what needed doing. He reached for his phone on the nightstand, looked at it for a moment, then set it back down and turned to Reed. "Before I make this call," Callum said, "I want to say something." Reed waited. I have spent 15 years being afraid of this specific version of myself, the one who wants what I want, who is who I actually am, underneath all the performance of being the other version. I was afraid of it because I didn't know what it looked like, whether it was survivable, whether there was anything on the other side of it worth what the crossing would cost. He looked at Reed steadily. You're what's on the other side of it, and I want you to know that before I make this call, and this day becomes what it needs to become, I want you to know that I am doing this because I am finally brave enough to want my actual life. And my actual life has you in it, in the real way, not the managed way. Reed felt something in his chest that had no single name, that was made up of 8 years of wanting, and last night and this morning, and the gray pre-dawn light coming through the window of a hotel suite that had become, against all planning, the room where everything changed. Make the call, Reed said gently. Callum picked up the phone. He breathed once, slow and deliberate, and then he called her. Reed moved to the chair by the window and sat there with his back to Callum, looking out at the city as it began its slow transition from pre-dawn to morning, the first pale differentiation of sky from skyline, the way Chicago woke up gradually, and then, all at once, he could hear Callum's voice behind him, low and measured and honest, and he did not listen to the words, only to the cadence of them, which was the cadence of a man who had decided to tell the truth and was doing it as well as anyone could be expected to do. Something that was going to hurt someone who had not done anything wrong. It took 11 minutes. Reed counted the light changing across the glass. When it was over, the room was quiet again, and Reed turned from the window, and Callum was sitting on the edge of the bed with his phone in his hands looking at the floor. His face was composed, but there was something in it that Reed recognized as the specific expression of someone who has done the right thing and is now inside the full weight of what the right thing costs. Reed crossed the room and sat beside him, said nothing, just sat. After a moment, Callum set the phone on the bedside table and pressed his hands flat against his thighs and breathed slowly, in through his nose, out through his mouth, the controlled breathing of a man managing something large. She was, he started, stopped. She was very calm, which is somehow harder than if she had been angry. Another breath. She said she had wondered for a while. She said she wasn't entirely surprised. He looked at the floor. I don't know if that's better or worse. Probably both, Reed said. Yeah. A long pause. She's going to be okay. She's the kind of person who will be okay. That doesn't make this not terrible, but it's something. It is something, Reed agreed. Callum sat with that for a moment. Then he said, I need to tell my family, and the guests, and there are a lot of arrangements to undo. He rubbed his face with both hands. It's going to be a very long day. Yes, Reed said. You said you'd be there for the long day. I meant it. Callum lowered his hands from his face and looked at Reed sideways. The gray-green eyes tired, honest, and very present. What do you need? Callum asked. From this, from today, from whatever comes after. I have been asking you to show up for me for 8 years. What do you actually need from this? I want to ask it properly. Reed thought about it, let himself think about it honestly, the way Callum had asked. I need this to be real, he said, not just last night. I need to know that when the chaos of today settles down and a month has passed and the dust has cleared, I'm not going to be the person you called in a moment of crisis who you then don't quite know how to face. I need to know this is something you're choosing in the ordinary, not just the emergency. Callum held his gaze without blinking. It's something I'm choosing in the ordinary, he said. Last night wasn't the choosing. Last night was the stopping pretending. The choosing has been happening for 4 years in Napa and every day since, and I am done waiting for the right moment to act on it. He reached over and took Reed's hand, the same way he had on the sofa the night before, unhurried and deliberate. I'm choosing this. You, the Tuesday version of this. Whatever ordinary looks like when it's us, I'm choosing it. Reed looked at their hands, at the window, at the morning fully arriving now over Chicago, the sky finding its color, pale blue at the east edge, the city waking up and beginning its loud and ordinary business. He thought about the wrong dorm room and everything that had followed from it, the 8 years of management and patience and careful loving from a distance, and he thought about last night and this morning, and Callum's voice on the phone being honest with someone even when it was devastating. And he thought that this was what it looked like when two people finally get to the thing they've been circling. Not a perfect moment, not a clean one, not arrived at without cost, but arrived at, real and arrived at, and worth every year of the getting there. Okay, Reed said. Okay, Callum said back. And then Reed reached up with his free hand and gently, without ceremony, turned Callum's face toward him and kissed him. Not the desperate urgency of last night, not the careful learning of the first kiss, but something new, something that didn't have a name for it yet, because it had only just come into existence. The kiss of two people who have agreed to begin, who are standing at the actual beginning of the thing, rather than its shadows and approximations, who have paid in full for whatever comes next with all the years of the getting here. When they broke apart, Callum rested his forehead against Reed's, and they stayed like that, not speaking, while the morning came fully through the window and the city went about its business. And somewhere in the hotel, wedding guests were waking up, not knowing yet that the day was going to be different from what they had planned. All of that was coming. The difficult conversations and the practical dismantling and the period of adjustment that would follow. The part where both of them had to figure out how two people who had been best friends for 8 years became something that had no precedent in either of their lives. All of that was coming, and it was not going to be simple. But for one more moment, they stayed exactly where they were, foreheads together in the morning light, hands interlocked, the city moving and breathing around them. And Reed thought that this was what it felt like, when something that had been waiting a very long time to exist finally stepped into the world and took up the space it had always been owed. It felt like coming home. Not the dramatic version of that, not the version with music under it, just the simple and total and completely ordinary feeling of being exactly where you were supposed to be, of having finally stopped moving away from something and started moving toward it, of knowing, with the quiet certainty that belongs to things that are simply true, that you are standing in your actual life. Come on, Reed said softly, getting to his feet. We need coffee before the hard stuff starts. Callum looked up at him, the tired gray-green eyes, the first real morning of everything that came next. You're going to make me face today sober, aren't you? I'm going to make you face today exactly as you are, Reed said, which is more than capable of handling it. Callum stood, reached for his shirt, paused, looked at Reed, and the smallest version of the smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. 8 years, he said. 8 years, Reed said back. We were spectacular idiots. Historically unprecedented ones. Callum finished buttoning his shirt, looked out at the morning over Chicago for a moment, at the city carrying on its enormous and indifferent business, at the pale blue sky with its suggestion of a day that was going to be many things, most of them complicated, but also, underneath and alongside all of those complicated things, the first day, the actual first day. Okay, he said, mostly to himself, to the window, to the version of himself he was becoming. Okay, let's go. And Reed walked with him toward the door, and the door opened, and the morning was there waiting, and they walked into it together. Not with grand statements and not with certainty about every step that followed, just with the decision, which was the only thing that had ever actually been required. The decision to stop circling and to enter, to stop performing and to be, to stop managing and to love, without the careful distance and without the managed version, with the actual real entire weight of it. To choose the ordinary, the Tuesday, the long day, each other. To go, they went.